Welcome to Last Chance to See, Jonathan M. Katz. I'm very excited he's here. Thank you for being here, Jonathan.
My pleasure.
He is a journalist and author. You may know his two books, The Big Truck That Went By and Gangsters of Capitalism. Before we get started, I'm going to do a quick plug for your book because I think there's probably a lot of people who have gotten an itch to learn more about American imperialism and Gangsters of Capitalism. I've definitely talked about it in public before. I loved it when it came out, and it couldn't be, unfortunately, more relevant right now. We wish it was, but it's incredible. It follows Smedley Butler and traces kind of the history of American imperialism. Extremely readable. Extremely it just like puts a lot into perspective, and I think if you're one of those people like I wish I understood this whole thing more, I can't recommend a better place to start.
Appreciate that. I agree.
Yeah.
I wish it was less relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very funny. I was looking back at our messages. I'd reached out on December 1st, and it just all feels very quaint. I was like, would you come on to talk about the escalating situation in Venezuela? And I thought maybe we'd chat a little bit about these illegal boat strikes and why they've gotten this in their mind that there's some kind of narco-terrorist cartel being run, and instead we are here in a very different world from December 1st. But I am glad you're here because I think it's it's been confusing. I think it's just like contradictions flying all over the place. I think between Trump and his own administration officials, and then just like different people online are taking issue with what you want to call this. And I think I'm not even sure, like, what did we do? Did we do an invasion? Did we do a regime change? So maybe we can start there. Maybe you can tell us kind of where we're at in the situation in Venezuela, like currently.
A good question. I don't think the Trump administration even knows where we're at. I don't think the Venezuelans know where we're at. It's hard to describe it as anything but an invasion, a brief invasion. But when you send the U.S. military into a sovereign country on air and land and supported from the sea, and then capture the president, it's hard to describe it as anything but an invasion. There's a lot of parallels, for instance, to the 1989 invasion of Panama, which we could talk about in a little bit, nobody disputes that was an invasion. The only difference was that in that case, it took about a week and a half to capture the leader. And in this case, it seems to have only taken a couple of hours. So it was brief, but it's hard to describe as anything, at least but a brief invasion. A big question is, it is a regime change operation in that the leader of the regime was captured and is now sitting in jail in Brooklyn, or at least he's being tried in New York. He was in Brooklyn at the beginning. I don't know if he's still at that particular facility, but his regime is still very much in power. The regime has not changed, and we can get more into the history for people who don't know. But this wasn't his regime. I mean, it is still known as a Chavista regime. It's still known as the regime of Hugo Chavez, who's the leader of Venezuela from the late 90s until he died in 2013. And Maduro was kind of his successor. He picked him as his successor. And there have been some continuities and discontinuities from the Chavez years. But suffice it to say that the entirety of everybody who was in power the morning that U.S. troops arrived is still in power, as far as I know, unless somebody's been dismissed, except for Maduro.
Right. And Delcy Rodriguez was Maduro's handpicked VP. Right. So nothing has changed. I've even seen reporting talking about, because obviously it's the same playbook, human rights violations. I mean, that's kind of a good question. it's people are talking about how bad how bad of a guy Maduro is, and my question is, does that even matter?
No, not if the it really doesn't in this case. I mean, it matters. It matters for its own lights. Like if we could have a conversation about Maduro and the things that he did and things he should be held accountable for, but absolutely nothing gives one country the right to go in and seize the leader of another country. There's no. That is a recipe for an extraordinarily unstable and unsustainable political system. I mean, I guess I could. No, I can't really. I mean, I could imagine, but I really can't even, because even if Venezuela had actually attacked the United States, which it didn't, but even if Venezuela had actually attacked the United States and it had been on orders of the president, and he had done it himself somehow, like it was some kind of King Leopold situation where he just personally attacked the United States. I mean, but we can get into all the counterfactuals that you want. Even then, you'd have a real hard case to make, and that's not the case here at all. I mean, there's a lot of people who are trying to sort of, through muscle memory, defend this by saying, oh, well, this was important to uphold democracy. He didn't win the 2024 election. I mean, I think that seems fairly apparent. Even left-wing governments in Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, no one recognizes him as the legitimate democratic winner of the last election in Venezuela. But Trump didn't even try to make that case. When he and Pete Hegseth and Marco Rubio and Raising Cane, General Raising Cane, got up to explain what had happened, I don't think I could be wrong. Certainly Trump didn't. I don't think any of them used the word democracy. I don't think any of them used the word election. And even if they had, it doesn't matter. Saddam Hussein didn't win a valid election. Overthrowing him was against international law and a mistake. And Trump loves people who rig elections. Some of his favorite leaders in the world are people who are democratically illegitimate. So it doesn't make any sense. There's no way to justify this unless you're just trying to kind of string together words to say it's cool.
Right. He didn't say the word democracy, but he did say the word oil a lot. Is this weird for you? You've spent so much time trying to contextualize all these the subterfuge and the manufacturing consent of all these things. And now we have a leader who just looks straight into the camera and is like, I just love oil so much. I need that black gold, baby. Is this very strange?
It's thanks. I mean, there's more to say about that, because even the oil, I would describe this entire thing, and I'm not the only one who's used this term, but it is overdetermined. There are so many reasons why the United States went into Venezuela, and none of them make any sense on their own.
I think that's why I've had such a hard time. I think and Trump has done this weird thing where, even when people kind of try to give him an out of okay, fine, maybe this is some kind of some ploy to keep oil away from China. And he's like, nope, I'm going to sell it to him. And
the oil doesn't even seem to be good oil. One of the weird things is that the oil companies. So we can talk about the history. Should we just very briefly talk about the history of oil in Venezuela? So Venezuela has very, very rich oil fields. It is believed to have the largest proven oil reserves in the world, even bigger than Saudi Arabia. And that oil has been drilled for many years. In the 1970s, the Venezuelan government nationalized its oil industry. And ordinarily, especially during the Cold War, when a country nationalized a major resource, that was sort of the cue for the United States to come in and invade and do some regime change. And we didn't. They didn't. And part of the reason they didn't was because the terms were seemingly acceptable, such as they were, to the U.S. oil companies. The Venezuelans created a company, PDVSA, PVSA, Petróleos Venezolanos SA. So like SA is like Inc. So it's basically like Venezuelan Petroleum Inc. And the terms were that 50% of the drilling companies had to be owned by PVSA, but it could still be in a partnership with a foreign company, a multinational, which tended to be an American company. This seemed to work more or less. I don't know the extent to which like all of the oil companies were really happy about this. The Americans certainly have a certain age. I guess there are still some Citgo stations in the States. There's a very famous one right outside of Fenway Park, right beyond the Green Monster. There's a big Citgo sign. That's the Venezuelan state oil company. They like ran gas stations in the States. And in the 1980s and the 1990s, during the big neoliberal turn, there's sort of a reprivatization to some extent. I mean, PVSA still exists, but more control is handed over to the multinationals. In the late 90s, Hugo Chavez comes to power. He wins an election, and he's a leftist. He's a leftist nationalist. His vision of Venezuela, he calls it the Bolivarian Revolution. So he's trying to invoke the name of Simón Bolívar, who was one of the revolutionary heroes who fought for and won independence of the northern part of South America from Spain. Okay, Bolivia is named for him, but his country that he founded was Colombia, which is now in retrospect known as Gran Colombia, like Great Colombia, because that got broken up into Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador, and then 1903 the United States chopped the top part of Colombia, Panama, off of Colombia to build the Panama Canal. And so Chavez is trying to sort of like invoke this revolutionary heritage. Although Simón Bolívar was very much a bourgeois revolutionary, like so he was an aristocrat. So this wasn't him sort of announcing himself as like a communist revolutionary. Although he also like sort of used communistic kind of iconography and ultimately made an alliance with Cuba, so he kind of gets put into that bucket.
But invoking like a shaking off of the colonial,
yeah. Simón Bolívar is often described in U.S.-centric terms as the George Washington of South America. So he's basically declaring himself a Washingtonian republic. And Bolivar and Washington have a lot in common, including the fact that they were rich guys. And I believe Bolivar owned slaves. I could be wrong about that. Washington obviously did for sure. Anyway, that's a totally separate issue. So Chavez comes to power, and his big goal is kind of these socialist projects where he's going to harness Venezuela's wealth, and Venezuela's major source of wealth is oil, and he's going to harness these oil riches for the people. And he doesn't do it immediately. He doesn't do what I'm about to describe immediately. He does embark on a bunch of kind of pro-social projects, and he does a lot of things that are not great. I mean, one of the biggest things that he does that I think doesn't put Venezuela on the best footing is he doesn't really diversify the economy, because oil prices are really high throughout the beginning part of his reign. And so he's very happy to just sort of like, they're just kind of printing money. They've got a ton of money. In fact, they have so much money that he starts giving oil at extremely preferential prices to other countries in the region, and becomes a big hero of a lot of the countries in the region, including Haiti, where I used to live. And there was a big monument to Hugo Chavez, or at least a big mural that was to Hugo Chavez. And he came and he visited Haiti and was greeted as a hero because it was known as Petrocaribe, and he gave this oil at extremely, extremely low rates it was basically a loan to these countries, but a lot of the countries assumed that they were never going to have to pay it back, including Haiti, which ended up getting Haiti in a lot of trouble with itself, with its own economy. But regardless, there's an attempt to overthrow Chavez in 2002. And there's a lot of reporting and a lot of historical work that's been done that shows that the George W. Bush administration, the United States, was involved in this. Either they knew about it and allowed it to happen, maybe they shared intelligence. It wasn't, I don't think, like a U.S.-driven project. The U.S. had its attention in other places at the time, but it is very clear that the U.S. at least had a hand in this. And Chavez is absolutely convinced that this is George W. Bush trying to overthrow him, right? This is the same era as Bush overthrowing Saddam Hussein and invading Iraq in 2003.
I mean, I was a teenager at the time, but I do remember the jingoist news coverage and, all of the focus on the Middle East. But then I remember all of a sudden hearing about Hugo Chavez and being like, okay, I guess we hate this guy too.
Yeah, he's, he is allies with Cuba. He's kind of uses some kind of semi communistic iconography. He wears a red shirt a lot. And he kind of gets put into that bucket. And so Americans kind of look at him in the same way that we've learned to, or been taught to look at Cuba for, more than half a century now. So in the wake of this coup, it's again, not immediate, but a couple years later, he starts getting much more nationalist. And one of the things that he does is in 2007, he promulgates a new law that says that now we're going to go back to 60% of these joint ventures have to be PVSA. They have to be Venezuelan state run. And if you're willing to play by that new rule, you have to go 60-40 us, right, from the Venezuelan perspective. Then the multinationals can stay. And if they don't want to do that, then they leave. And in fact, one of the multinationals, Chevron, accepts the deal, and they have still been operating in Venezuela to this day. So anybody who says sort of imagines this as kind of a Stalinist total nationalization, kicking out the kulaks, that's not what happened here. The two big companies that I'm aware of that didn't take the deal were ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. They leave, and Venezuela seizes their assets that they've left behind. And this actually becomes the subject of arbitration. There's some court cases. I believe that Exxon and ConocoPhillips both reclaimed some of their lost material. The rest of it, I think they probably just gave up on. They just kind of wrote it off. As all of this is happening, and so this is what Trump is this is part of the history that Trump is referring to when he says wrongly that Venezuela stole our oil.
And even in that, but you mentioned those lawsuits. I believe those are important because I think that so this was all litigated, and I think the companies tried to say here's all our losses, and it was something like, I don't know, $18 billion, and throughout the legal process they were like, it's probably more like $1.6 billion, and they were paid for that. So I just want to point that out because it is this history you're describing is the backbone of Trump saying that we had our oil stolen. That's American oil.
There are shades of Jacobo Arbenz, who was the president of Guatemala in the 1950s, who also was not a communist. He was a liberal, and but he was willing to he wasn't going to just do everything the United States wanted him to do. He gets overthrown in 1954. This is a really important moment in the history of Latin America. Che Guevara is on the ground in Guatemala when this overthrow happens. This is one of the things that really radicalizes him and turns him into the more violent revolutionary that he becomes. And then he's from Argentina, but then he goes to Cuba and helps Fidel Castro. This is a really seminal moment in the history of Latin America during the Cold War. And Arbenz also, in that case, was expropriating land. The land belonged to the United Fruit Company, which is now Chiquita Brands International, which had been in Guatemala, had been in Central America, for years at that point, growing bananas for export, just like Chiquita does today. And they had been a huge beneficiary of what are known as the banana wars, which is a lot of the wars that I write about in Gangsters of Capitalism in the first decades of the 20th century. These were basically wars for land and export rights for U.S. companies, especially United Fruit in this area. And Arbenz in 1954 announces that he's going to expropriate land, because land is a very valuable commodity, obviously, in any country, but especially a poor agrarian country like Guatemala. And he says, I'm going to repay. This is one of the things that people don't remember, if they even remember anything about this. He says, I'm going to repay United Fruit for the value of the land, but I'm going to repay them not at the rate that they claim that the land is worth, but at the rate that they claim that land is worth on their taxes, because they were paying taxes at a lower rate to the Guatemalan government than they were now claiming that the land was worth. And so that is what gets him overthrown. That's what gets him overthrown. And the Dulles brothers, Alan and John Foster, the namesake of Dulles Airport to this day in the DC area in Northern Virginia, had been lawyers for United Fruit. They worked for Sullivan and Cromwell, which was the big law firm that also still exists to this day. They had come up as investors in and defending United Fruit as lawyers. Now Alan Dulles is the head of the CIA and John Foster is the Secretary of State under Dwight Eisenhower, the president. And so they go and do this work for United Fruit again. So I'm just saying that it kind of reminds me of that, because it's like the amount that is stolen, quote unquote, is the difference between the vastly inflated claim and the much lower claim that is actually agreed on, that is actually found to have been the actual amount by U.S. courts, by international arbiters. But the other piece of it that I think is very different is that in 1954, it seems very clear that United Fruit was mad. Like, they were losing their land. They wanted the full value of what they thought that they were owed, as opposed to the value that they lied about and were paying the Guatemalan government for. Whereas in this case, it seems like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips and maybe Chevron, I don't know, it doesn't seem like they really care all that much. If Trump is having to try to berate them and drag them into his resource extraction scheme, they seem to basically be like, we're okay. And also, do we really, apparently the oil is heavy crude. It's really hard to refine. And also, do they even want more oil on the market? Because if you put more oil on the world market, oil prices go down, which is bad for their business. So it doesn't seem like they're really interested in it. But Trump has this idea of resource extraction, but it doesn't seem like actually in this case the capitalists do.
Yeah, it's all very strange. It's very unclear if they're even interested. The capital expenditure that I've seen some experts on this talk about is at least in the tens of billions of dollars, if it's not close to $100 billion. That's a massive expense. And as you're talking about, they may not even want to do that and the price of oil right now is not that high. It's not like you're in an environment where you're talking about $100 plus for a barrel of oil. And I mean, who wants to go in and spend all this money in this country they just destabilized? And he's talking about, we might just go do another invasion.
Exactly. And also the Chavista regime, like I said, is still in power. So if you're ExxonMobil, I mean, Chevron is still there and they've had these relationships for years. But if you're ExxonMobil, you're looking at this and you're like, all right, so this country's really pissed at Americans right now, for good reason. The leadership is very unstable. I'm sure there are going to be people who are going to be trying to take their shots at the regime. Because, anytime you have something like this happen, the U.S. wargamed this during Trump's first administration. And unsurprisingly, when they tried to figure out what happens if we overthrow Maduro, what happens is what always happens. Everybody comes in. It's like, I get to be president now. Now it's, this is my pet project. I'm going to do this. I have this militia like in the mountains of Venezuela. I'm going to come down to Caracas and I'm going to take it for myself. Like if you're an oil executive, like business guys, for the most part, they tend to be pretty risk averse. I was going to use a more like personally insulting term, but let's just say they tend to be mostly risk averse. Like if they, it's like they're looking at this and they're like, God, okay, so we get to invest a whole bunch of money in a country where people hate us. The workers are all going to be the people who hate us. And like, we'll be like sabotaging our machines. And also like, then if we do that, all we get out of it is like this oil that's really hard to refine. And then we'll lower the price of our other, it's like, you know what? We're good, actually. Thank you, gangsters. But like, we don't actually need this. Maybe what they're thinking.
And the worst part is, I mean, I'm seeing because of that unwillingness to go in there and do this massive expenditure, I'm seeing Trump float the idea of subsidizing this whole adventure for them. So it means if he really wants to push forward this resource extraction thing, it's of course going to fall on taxpayers to do so.
And he's claiming that the oil will pay for whatever he does, which citation needed. I mean, I think a lot of it is on the oil front is, he loves oil, right? And like, he kind of has like, fossil fuels are kind of his personal brand. And like, maybe he's thinking like, well, if we get a bunch of oil, then like we'll stop having wind power and solar power, which like really offends him for like weird, deeply psychological reasons. And also like oil prices. Like he loves lower oil prices, and his base loves lower oil prices. And like anytime that they can be like, hey, gas prices are, there were those T-shirts during the 2024 election, like mean tweets, cheap gas. Like they love that. So, I think that might be part of his thinking, but it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't actually make any sense.
Yeah, and I don't know if it is playing with his base, and maybe you have your own theories. As we were saying a bit more up top, like it's hard to find a reason that makes real clear sense here. I mean, is it just as simple as wanting to take heat off of the Epstein file stuff? Is it I don't know. Does he think like this could drum up popularity? It doesn't seem to be, at least on preliminary polling, it does not seem like this is a popular thing with people.
I think, I mean, like I said, I think the word here is overdetermined. It's a lot like Iraq in that way, and we could talk about that separately, but like just talking about the specifics in Venezuela, you have all these different camps in the Trump administration that are competing against each other for influence and to get their projects, right? Seems like the way that Trump works, even more than other US presidents, is that he kind of he pits these factions against one another. He loves creating like internal rivalries. And he gets these different groups to sort of like, fight for prominence and try to get these ideas like in front of him and get his attention. And one of the big groups is his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio like wants this for purely ideological and frankly kind of cultural reasons. His family's Cuban. They're not actually exiles from Castro. His parents came before that, but he grew up in Miami, like in the exile community. And if anyone doesn't know about like the Cuban exile community in Miami, they're nuts. I mean, do respect on like, but like, like they really, and interestingly, some of this has been, kind of softening with the current generation. But they have been, hardcore demanding a full invasion and like mass killing of the communist regime in Cuba, the Communist Party of Cuba. They are mad. They have been big mad for a very, very long time. And of course, the United States did try to invade. Well, we trained some of them. We trained some Cuban exiles in 1961, and sent them to the Bahía de los Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs, and that became a fiasco. Kennedy didn't send air support. They 100 or so of them were killed. And in Miami, it's kind of, in parts of Miami, it is always 1961, like forever. Like it's like until that generation is gone, like they just want to keep replaying the Bay of Pigs over and over again until it works. And this is the situation that Rubio grew up in. And he's kind of a temperamentally a neoconservative. He doesn't really come from like the neoconservative, like philosophical base, but like his idea of like the ideal U.S. foreign policy is going overseas and overthrowing, enemies of the United States. And his big enemy that he's had at the top of his list is Cuba. And just beneath them are sort of the other regimes that Cuba supports and is friends with. And Venezuela is first of all, one of the biggest, and also has been one of the most vulnerable for many years. Because one of the pieces that I didn't mention in what I was talking about before, and we're talking about why, for instance, the oil infrastructure is so degraded and why the economy in Venezuela is so bad. There's a lot of reasons for it. And again, one of them is that Chavez and then Maduro like didn't ever diversify the economy. And then when oil prices came down, that destroyed the economy. But also there have been aggressive U.S. sanctions against Venezuela for many years and have made it basically impossible for them to crawl out of whatever holes they're in, whether self-dug or otherwise. And so it has been this just big rotting plum that is sitting there on the lowest branch that Rubio has been looking at. And his idea is, we're going to grab that one. We're going to do regime change in Venezuela, and then we'll do Nicaragua, and then we'll do who knows what else, and then the big one we'll go for Cuba. And so that is his project. And then there are other strains as well. You just have the military industrial complex,
well, also just like classic neocons. I mean, Lindsey Graham is just salivating every time I see. I mean, grinning ear to ear. He's putting on the maker on great again. So there is there's all kinds of competing factions to just carve up the world right now in the Trump administration.
That goes back, like I was saying, like Iraq. It's a whole other long conversation. But when people try to ask, like, why did we invade Iraq in 2003? That was also very overdetermined. There were a whole bunch of different camps in the Bush administration that were arguing for different reasons to invade Iraq. But the one thing that they all agreed on was, let's invade Iraq. And so Iraq got invaded. And so, and I think this is sort of a similar situation. It's like, you've got kind of the America first, but like expansionists, the hemispherists who are like, we need to fly the flag all over the hemisphere. You've got the anti-immigration people, and the white supremacists who are like, we need to show that we're tough against these people who we don't code as white, and also give us a legal basis to do all these things at home, because like a lot of the powers that Trump has claimed to have, for instance, for his mass deportation, are wartime powers. Well, the courts keep saying, well, but we're not at war. Well, that gets fixed if you go to war. You've got the people who just like have the toys and want to use them and want to sell new toys to replace the old toys that get used in an invasion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got all these different camps, but it seems like for whatever reason, all of their oars were kind of pointing in the same direction. And we're pointing in the direction enough to be like, let's do a limited invasion and capture the president. Also, we'll look really cool on social media. I think that's a big one. I'm not even kidding.
Trump literally talking about how it's like I was watching a movie, the invasion, when they were watching it. You've been talking about kind of these past examples and the similarities. I'm kind of curious if you see this time as different, though. Obviously, there's no shortage of American intervention in Latin America. There's no shortage of America overthrowing people, but Trump often feels different, and I can't just tell if it feels different because his rhetoric is so insane. It's jarring. I mean, there's that famous quote that everyone has posted about. I believe he was talking about Venezuela at the time, where he's like, "Look, we're just going to go in and kill them. They will be like dead." And so I'm curious, in your view, if this just feels different because it's Trump and he's so insane, he's willing to just come out and say, "No, we're doing this for oil. I want to kill people," or is this really different? I mean, it certainly feels different to me, especially with them just like listing off. If I was Colombia, I'd be nervous. If I was Cuba, I'd be nervous. If I was Mexico, I'd be nervous. They're talking about Greenland.
Yeah, that one's different. Like going after a European, because Greenland belongs to Denmark, and going after a NATO ally and a European power is different. That's not a thing that the United States has ever done. The United States has often been very comfortable interfering in, invading non-European countries, like non-white countries. But like going to war against Denmark, that's new. I mean, one thing that I would say is that, so going back to historical analogy and going back to, the early 20th century, the years that I was writing about principally in Gangsters. Gangsters, I do like, as you know, like a past present thing. So I write about a lot of things that also happened since then. But the Smedley Butler timeline of sort of like these groundwork and ground destroying and then rebuilding moments in America's imperial history. One thing that I think is worth noting is that was not a single story in that period either. That period goes through a bunch of different presidents, and all of those presidents had their own ways of thinking about the world and approaching it. William McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, big departure from them in a lot of ways. And then you get the Republican trio in the 1920s, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. And then you get FDR, who comes into power, but he's in the book, in part because Smedley Butler overthrows or blows the whistle on a plot to overthrow FDR and replace him with a fascist dictator in 1934. But before that, FDR is an assistant secretary of the Navy, and he's personally helping oversee the U.S. occupations of Haiti and Nicaragua, and is actually on the ground in Haiti with Smedley Butler for a period. And so he kind of plays both roles of this, because as president, he unwinds this sort of imperial project to some extent in the 1930s with the good neighbor policy, but it was a project that he helped build up in the 19-teens, in the 1920s, the 19-teens, I guess. So, but I just wanted to note that each of those presidents had their own vision of what they were trying to do, and they were building on and in a lot of ways responding to what their predecessors had done. So just to use like a kind of a point counterpoint, on the one hand, you've got Teddy Roosevelt, who was ideologically an imperialist. He came to it from a very white supremacist point of view, but he's specifically, and also like a gender point of view. Like a lot of what he was doing was trying to prove his own and America's manhood. He's very explicit about this. He gives speeches about this. And he's talking about, how we have to colonize the Philippines, which we had fought with the Filipinos against the Spanish. The Philippines had been a Spanish colony for 3 centuries. And then we got into the war for Cuba, but Teddy Roosevelt encourages the Navy to just, while we're at it, attack the Spanish fleet in Manila Harbor, sinks the Spanish fleet. It's a catastrophic victory is really a technical term, because I don't think anybody realized exactly how big this victory was going to be. And all of a sudden now the Spanish are extraordinarily weak in the Philippines because their Pacific fleet is at the bottom of the ocean. And so the Americans decide to go into the Philippines, partner with the Filipinos, but then cut a side deal with the Spanish to colonize the Philippines. When the Filipinos hear about this, they don't like it. So they rebel against the Americans, and this starts the Philippine-American War, which is a really brutal and really, really horrific war that lasts for many years. And, Teddy Roosevelt is looking at this, and he's saying, like, literally he says, we have to conquer the Philippines, because if we don't, some better and manlier empire will come and do it for us. And so we have to show the world who's boss. And it's basically, might makes right. His famous saying, speak softly and carry a big stick, which he claimed was an African proverb, which probably wasn't. And so he's saying, like, his point of view was, we need to do this. We need to do this to prove American power, to prove that America sits at the big boy table with England, with France, is a peer to Germany, which is a rising empire at this time that Roosevelt had a lot of affection for. And that's kind of his point of view. Wilson comes to power some years later and is responding to all of the things that have happened during this time. And Wilson is approaching this from a liberal point of view. He's also super racist. He grew up super racist. He resegregates the federal workforce. He's more racist on a domestic level than Teddy Roosevelt was, but shares some of his, white supremacist assumptions about the rest of the world. But Wilson is a Wilsonian, and his idea is that this is a moral good, that the United States will go into these places and teach these inferior peoples how to be, good, small d, democratic citizens, and to make the world a better place, but under our tutelage. And under that idea of Wilsonian internationalism, that the United States will go places and intervene for the betterment of the world, right? This is Wilson's point of view. And it ends up being, equally, if not more destructive, because Wilson oversees the invasion of Haiti in 1915, which ends up being a 19-year occupation, the invasion of the Dominican Republic. He oversees the occupation of Nicaragua, where the United States had already been interfering for several years. But so this is sort of Wilson's idea. And so Roosevelt's idea is basically direct colonization. We're going to directly colonize the Philippines. We have already directly colonized Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, and we're going to, they will be subject parts of the United States. And then there's negotiation that goes on where basically the Supreme Court says they will be part of the United States, but those people will have fewer rights than we do because they're not white. But there will be wholly owned colonies. And Wilson is saying, no, we are not colonizers. We are simply occupiers. We will just, and this is the formal word he uses, that like the official name of the U.S. occupation of Haiti is the U.S. capital O occupation of Haiti. And the reason why Wilson picks that idea, why this becomes the rhetoric, is because we are not colonizers. That is for Europeans. We simply occupy for a little while, during which time we will, teach these people the good way to be citizens. Oh, and by the way, like, let our businesses and our banks make a whole bunch of money on the side, right? That was a long digression, but that is all to say that, like, these points of view are very much at odds with one another. And throughout this period, you have enormous fights within even the imperialist class between people who say, like, we need the iron fist. We need to kill all of these people because that's the only way. Violence is the only language that they know. And then you have other people who are like, no, we must teach them. We must show them to be as close to the grandness of white Americans as possible. Although they all, the effects from the ground often feel very much the same. Trump is another thing. He, in a lot of ways, is a lot like the guy who comes at the beginning of all this, William McKinley, who is just a capitalist, and he's like beholden to his investors, to his donors. He had gone into serious debt in 1893. There was a really bad economic depression, and these guys come in, they bail him out. And they were like, and he had been a congressman, and he had proposed, his name was on the big tariff bill in 1890 that helped sink the economy in 1893. And so these guys come in, they rescue him, and they say, we're going to make you governor of Ohio, and now we're going to make you president of the United States. And his investors weren't terribly interested in like overseas empires, since it was a thing that the United States hadn't yet done. But that also ends up becoming kind of an overdetermined intervention in Cuba in 1898. But the ultimate thing that convinces McKinley to get involved with that is this argument that this is going to make a lot of money for American businesses. And it's not going to be that much. It's not going to be a really heavy lift. The Spanish will be easy to defeat. And then we're also not going to have to directly govern Cuba. So you don't have to worry about like being the president of these non-white Catholic Spanish-speaking people. But he also didn't really think through any of these things. Like he never thought about what the next step was going to be. He was just kind of always just going from one thing to another. He's like, oh, I guess I'll be president now. Oh, I guess I'll invade Cuba now. Oh, wait, we have the Philippines? Oh, how did that happen? I guess we're going to have to like put down this rebellion. I guess. I don't know. At no point does he have any kind of plan. Trump reminds me a lot of that. Trump invoked McKinley in his inaugural address a year ago. I think the only thing he knew about him was the McKinley tariff and the fact that there's a large mountain that has at times had his name in Alaska, a mountain that McKinley never saw. But it's, Trump kind of reminds me of that, but he's also his own thing. So all the point of that whole digression is to say that, in history, you talk about continuities and discontinuities. And there are continuities through all of these things that I think probably came through in that long story that I just told. But there's also discontinuities in it as well, and presidents who fight each other, and different parties that are all fighting each other throughout that. So in some ways, the discontinuity is itself a continuity. Like Trump coming out of that tradition and sort of looking at that tradition and looking at the things the United States did during the Cold War and trying to wind the clock back to this 19th century vision of empire. He is sort of almost inevitably inheriting a bunch of these different traditions and a bunch of these contradictions, and then bringing his own mishigas, his own craziness to it.
He's evoking a lot of those. You mentioned McKinley, but we've also got the Don Roe doctrine now, and we've got the Trump corollary, which. Maybe you could explain briefly just how he's kind of bastardizing those things. And I'm sure a lot of people, the Monroe Doctrine has been misinterpreted many times over the last however many 100+ years. So maybe we could briefly explain what he's talking about when he's invoking the Don Roe Doctrine in a little bit. You brought up Teddy Roosevelt, but his own expansion of that with the Roosevelt corollary.
Yeah, so the so-called Monroe Doctrine, it's not really a thing, is now 203 years old this year. Happy birthday. It was one of the, so when people hear about the Monroe Doctrine, what they're really often thinking of is the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Because Roosevelt's vision of it was that it was this idea that the United States could do whatever it wanted in the Western Hemisphere in order to keep out European interference. That was basically his corollary. He gets that from squinting at the Monroe Doctrine. But the Monroe Doctrine, such as it was never that in the first place. It wasn't even written by James Monroe. In 1823, Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who then becomes president of the United States a little while later, Adams comes up with this idea and he puts it into a State of the Union address, right? Which is not even spoken, it's just delivered to Congress. It's just sort of like, here's how things are in the year of our Lord, 1823. And among a bunch of other things that Monroe is talking about in this State of the Union, he talks about the newly independent republics of South America, South and Central America. that have been getting their independence. As I was referencing Simon Bolivar, that's what he's talking about, right? It's these revolutions against Spain to create independent countries. And there is a lot of question in the 1820s about what is going to happen with these new republics. Are they going to remain independent, or is some other European power going to come in and colonize them, specifically the British? Everybody was looking to Britain, right? It's the big world empire, and like Britain was looking to these guys as like, oh, well, if Spain doesn't want them anymore, maybe we'll take them. And this was just John Quincy Adams ventriloquizing through James Monroe, who at that point is the president, saying, we support the independence of these South American republics. We would prefer if Britain stayed away. That's it. There's no teeth to it. The United States can't do any. I mean, it's 1823. The United States can't do anything about this. We had just fought Britain to a tie on our own soil. We weren't going to go like fight a war against Britain over Chile. It was just this notional idea, this kind of declaration of solidarity with our sister republics in the Western Hemisphere, that we don't want the Europeans to be interfering with them anymore.
Right. Like, this is the new world, hands off of us, Europe, and that includes this entire hemisphere.
Yeah. We believe because like, it's one of these things that could have gone either way, right? It's like the United States comes from a British tradition. They're white, they're English speaking. They could have been, this is why Adams writes this in, because he's saying like, well, we could support like, the Anglicization of South America. But instead they're taking it from a small r Republican, point of view. Like, we got our independence, they got their independence, good on you. This isn't a thing for decades. Later in the 19th century, you start having various Americans starting imagining, for various reasons, annexing countries, colonies, specifically in the Caribbean, to make them states. The big one is the slave power, the slave caucus in the States really wants to annex Cuba, because Cuba is an enormous slave colony, and it would provide a lot of votes for the slave power in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. And then that doesn't go anywhere. And at that moment, people start saying like, well, I remember James Monroe said something about no European interference in the hemisphere. Well, what if we liberated Cuba from Spain? Wouldn't that be kind of in keeping with Mr. Monroe's doctrine? Like, that's kind of where they start talking about it. But it doesn't go anywhere because, again, they can't do anything about this. So it isn't until Teddy Roosevelt, as part of his empire building project, he is trying to come up with a justification for interfering in, actually specifically the Dominican Republic is kind of the first test case that he has. And it's not a military interference, it's a financial interference. The Dominican Republic is heavily in debt to a number of European countries, and Roosevelt comes in and basically convinces them to switch their debt out to JP Morgan, to the United States. And he does this citing the Monroe Doctrine. And he's saying like, this gives us, this principle in our past says that we believe that we have the right to intervene reluctantly, this is the way he puts it, as a police power in our hemisphere in order to keep out European influence. And this is a nonsense statement for several reasons when Roosevelt makes it. First of all, the United States is very much not only concerned with its own hemisphere at that point, as evidenced by the fact that it is putting down a rebellion in the Philippines, which I don't know if you've looked at a map recently, not in the Western Hemisphere. Second of all, this is not anything that Monroe said. It's not a corollary to a Monroe Doctrine. It's not even a thing. People talk about the Monroe Doctrine like it's part of the Constitution, or like it's some like law that like Americans all got together to vote on, and we're like, we say with one voice that we can interfere anywhere we want in the hemisphere. Which, even if we did that, that wouldn't really be a thing either.
Right. That doesn't give us that doesn't give us the right.
But it's not even that.
Yeah.
It's not even that. It's just literally this one, like this, just a president once said something in the State of the Union in 1823 that got interpreted and like turned on its head and goes from being an anti-colonial statement to a defense of colonialism in the early 20th century. And that is what Trump is trying to grab. But what Trump is doing, the reason Trump is doing it, he's doing it for the same reason that Roosevelt did it. Because by citing James Monroe, who was a founder of the United States, one of the founding fathers of the United States, like by citing this thing that he said once, it gives it this air of legitimacy. It gives it this air of historical fact. It's like you can't argue against the Monroe Doctrine. It is one of our founding principles, even though it's not, and is not what he said.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're approaching an hour here. I don't want to keep you too long. I want to just briefly kind of talk about where this could maybe go. I think, unfortunately, you talked a lot about some of these prior things, and I wonder if the audience picked up on the pattern of you saying, he was he was more of a liberal before America got involved and turned him into more of a nationalist, hardened, whatever. That pattern is very real throughout these adventures in American imperialism. And it's unfortunate that there's a lot of people like you who study the history, know the history, and know that it does not work out the way these people. I don't think they think about it. I think they just do, as we've been talking about a lot of these things. But as you've mentioned, what it often leads to is chaos. What it often leads to is blowback. Us getting stuck in quagmires that never ending. I mean, Trump's already talking about, we could end up, this could be a years-long project of trying to occupy Venezuela. Obviously, my hope is that, as much as I dislike the guy, that there's some kind of, I don't know, Deus Ex Machina. We get I wish it was like the tariff situation where I would just wake up and find out, oh, he's not doing that anymore. But I'm wondering, obviously you don't have a crystal ball, but how do you feel about how the road we're heading down with this?
Again, I mean, it's really hard to say. If you had put the list of options together that I thought that he would try, I mean, in retrospect, it kind of makes sense.
You did seem in your writing. I saw you were pretty certain that the invasion would happen. Am I right on that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, look, you don't move all of that firepower and all those assets to the region, and and they're killing all these people on these boats, these supposed drug boats, although they've shown no evidence that. I'm sure many of them are drug boats, but like they've shown no evidence of this.
And the only one there was some reporting in the New York Times of the one that did wash up, because I think a lot of them sank, and the best they could find was some like marijuana residue in some packets.
Yeah. Look, there's a lot of cocaine in South America. There's no fentanyl. So, and this is why, and the reason why the Trump administration has to keep invoking fentanyl is because that's the drug that people are concerned about today. Like in the United States, like that's both the moral panic and the real material reality of you have all these fentanyl overdoses, which are horrific. And so if you can sort of link these things together, it's a whole lot. That's a whole. I didn't even bring up like the drug aspect of it. Yeah. But there's again, like I said, it's overdetermined. There's all these different things. And using the threat of drugs to create a moral panic and to make people feel that they're under siege, or feel that like a tragedy that has happened in their family is the fault of these foreigners. That's an old move. Like that's something that's been done since the 1980s. And in a lot of ways, even before that. But all that is to say, this limited intervention, I guess you can call it, like this, like kidnapping exfil operation, kind of has in common with what Trump did in Iran, right? With the so-called 12-day war, which that was another one where I was like, oh God, we're at war with Iran. And then all of a sudden we weren't at war with Iran. But we may still be at war with Iran. And we may still be at war with Venezuela. Is sort of the long and short of it there, because Trump, he's afraid of long-term war. He's physically a coward, right? I mean, he's physically afraid of going to war. He very famously dodged the draft in Vietnam, and didn't even dodge it in the way that, like, any respectable conservative in the 1960s and 70s joined the National Guard, and they at least were like on a ship somewhere, like not in Vietnam. And he didn't even do that, right? He was just at home.
He had bone spurs.
Bone spurs, exactly. I mean, I don't want to be ableist. Like, bone spurs can be very painful. But all that is to say that, like, he doesn't seem to really have the temperament to, like, want to be responsible for a long-term war. Also, his base, like a lot of the reason he became president, one of the big reasons he became president in 2016, was because he was out there, saying what other Republicans wouldn't say, which was that the war in Iraq was a horrific mistake. Of course, he supported the war in Iraq at the beginning, and then he lied about it during the campaign. But nonetheless, like, he was that's a lot of his base, and and you can see, like, there are real fractures in MAGA about the issue of what they understand to be a war, which to them would mean their brothers and uncles and cousins and dads and sons going overseas to fight. And he really, really does want to, it seems like he does want to avoid that. But just because he wants to avoid that doesn't mean that he's going to be able to avoid it. I mean, either everyone forgets that this happened somehow, which doesn't seem likely to me, or people are going to be, opening their eyes at, in the coming months and being like, Delcy Rodriguez is still in charge. Like, the Maduro Chavez Rodriguez regime is still in power. And, who knows, like, what form blowback could take, right? Like, who knows, there could be an attack on Americans somewhere. There could be, maybe some Americans have to come ashore in Venezuela, or are there, like, guarding an oil rig, and then, like, they get attacked by somebody or other, or, like, some other overdetermined series of events. Maybe there's, a huge, like, there's already been some really damning stuff about Trump in the Epstein files. Maybe that comes back into the conversation again. Maybe something even more damning comes out. And then, he feels the need to escalate, which then gets us into another escalatory spiral, which ends up in a situation that he can't control. So it would be wrong to say, like, no one knows exactly what's going to happen. But the one thing that is very, very, very clear in both Venezuela and Iran, like, as all these different situations, is that this is not over. Like what we have done is very clearly something that is more at the beginning of the story than at the end of it. Another piece of it, by the way, maybe to put a bow on it, is, one thing that people who, like, look at this sort of in global political strategic terms is that it's very clear that, like, part of the overdetermined justification for this is that Venezuela is part of the U.S. sphere of influence, that the Donroe doctrine is that basically, we get to control this hemisphere, which I don't think that most of the people in the hemisphere would agree with, but that seems to be what he thinks. But other people who agree with that point of view are Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. And I'm not the only one saying this, but I'll say it. I would not be surprised at all if we see escalations in Ukraine or Moldova, or maybe even, Poland, Romania, or, Taiwan or the South China Sea on China's part. Because it would be really weird for Trump, for anybody in the United States, anybody in an official capacity these days, to, say to Putin, well, you don't get to just, like, overthrow you don't get to just kidnap the president of Poland Like, that's not a thing you can do when we just did that. And you might say, well, what about NATO? But Trump is threatening a NATO ally right now with a kind of Putin-style land grab in Greenland. So I would not, and I think one of the most dangerous things about this is that, again, just like I was saying, oil executives are very risk averse. It pays in a global grand strategic sense to be risk averse about competition between, these big nuclear armed superpowers. And it is a real uncertain thing, what would happen if, Putin, he's already been testing in Eastern Europe with like drone flights and errant missiles, supposedly. Maybe he decides, I'll try it. I'm going to try it. I'm going to go into Poland. I'm going to go try to grab this piece of Poland and see what everybody does. And who the hell knows what happens if that happens? And it's a real dangerous place to be.
Why not? Trump basically gave them the game plan. What is anyone going to have to say when they just go, okay, well, we're just going to have the equivalent of our Justice Department draw up a little indictment, and at that point we got to go get him and take him to stand trial, because that's the way it works now.
Yeah. This piece, and it could even just be like this governor in Estonia. Seems corrupt to me. He's trafficking drugs into Russia. We have no choice but to take him. And then because we took him, it created this instability. So we have to occupy it for a little while, just until things have sorted themselves out, which is exactly what Trump is saying we're going to do in Venezuela.
Yeah, it's a very scary, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it at a very scary end to this conversation, because we just don't know what's going to happen. Maybe we'll be able to have you back on if things further develop. I desperately hope they don't further develop. I think if something with Greenland happens, we will be waking up in a different world, and that's a very scary prospect. But maybe you could take this opportunity to plug anything you want, or tell people where to find you on the internet.
Sure. Best place to find me on the internet is my newsletter, The Racket. You can find it at theracket.news. I write about a lot of the things that we're talking about here, and we'll be covering all of these things going forward. And my books are Gangsters of Capitalism and The Big Truck That Went By: How the World Came to Save Haiti and Left Behind a Disaster. That was my book about the Haiti earthquake in 2010. And you can. I also have a TikTok, which is it's at Katz on Earth. And I often post things on there.
Incredible. And I'll put links to, I can put links to everything in the description so people will easily be able to find it. Thanks once again for coming on. This was great. And I think probably very informative for people in this very confusing time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.